Hi, I'm Dave, the Hardcore Philatelist, and this is the first episode of Showing Stamps Talking History, featuring the large dragons of China from 1878 to 1885. While you're with me, I'll try to highlight some of the enjoyment of stamp collecting, a hobby of personal expression that's entertained millions of people since the issuing of the penny black by Britain in May of 1840. Believe it or not, the world of stamp collecting is very busy if you know where to look. According to the Wall Street Journal in 2014, there are 60 million stamp collectors across the planet. 40 million in Asia, and 1/3 or 20 million of those reside in China. At heart, I'm a worldwide stamp collector with over 30 years of expanding my collection. That being said, I do have some countries I like to focus on, which include China, Mexico, and Brazil. My plan for Showing Stamps Talking History is to take an in-depth look at selected stamps from my collection and the history surrounding them, the political climate, trade disputes, wars, along with the development of postal services and the people involved with design. My hope is to bring the stamps alive and out of the album, maybe getting you to take another look at your own collection or your family's collection stored in an out-of-the-way place. Big part of the philatelic fun of a modern stamp collector is finding out more about your material. Recently, I've learned quite a lot from watching other YouTube channels about stamp collecting, such as Graham Beck's Exploring Stamps, TED Talk Stamps, and the RMPL Lecture Series. These channels, as well as other stamp collecting communities such as the American Philatelic Society, can easily be accessed through a site called the Digital Philatelist. The core concept of Showing Stamps Talking History is to cover the elements of circumstance. This is also known as the 5 W's and 1 H. Back in the day, I learned about these elements while in grade school analyzing the first paragraph of a newspaper article. In this episode, my interpretation of who, what, where, when, why, and how goes something like this. The who is Robert Hart, Li Hongzhang, and Gustav Dietering. The what, China's first postage stamps, the large dragons. The where, Qing Dynasty China. The when, 1878 to 1885. The why, to represent the Qing Dynasty to the world. The how, steady persistence. To understand what's happening in China regarding communication by the 1800s, you need to know there are two independent letter services, the Yichan and the Minqiu. The oldest form was the Yichan. It was a series of stations throughout China with various degrees of sophistication depending on what dynasty you're looking at. It was used by rulers and functionally running as early as the Zhou dynasty over 2,500 years ago. The purpose was to give rulers information on the frontiers and to transmit the edicts of the rulers to officials. It was not for regular people or personal interests of officials. In fact, during the Tang Dynasty, the punishment for misuse of the Yichan was 100 heavy blows. Must have hurt. Then there was the Minqiu, which came into existence around 600 years ago during the Ming Dynasty. Anyone could send a message if fees were paid. Fees could be paid in 3 ways, all paid by sender, half and half, all paid by the addressee. Unfortunately for the Minqiu system, the couriers had no universal organization, capital was limited, and the equipment was not very reliable. Before we get into China's first postage stamp, the creation of the Imperial Maritime Customs Service has to occur. To understand how that came about, a brief discussion of international trade, opium trafficking, and unequal treaties punishing the Qing Dynasty will be covered, although briefly. I see the beginning of a chaotic future seems to be about 1700, when the Dutch introduced China to recreational drug use by popularizing opium smoking in a tobacco pipe. 29 years later, opium was declared illegal for recreation, but remained prominent in medicine. That edict in 1729 may have slowed down the illegal trade, but by 1757 the British had taken over Bengal, India. Then they ramped up exports to 2,000 chests of opium a year into China by 1767. And then it got worse. To some, the operation of opium trafficking by foreign governments could be thought of as a conscious plan to weaken the Qing Dynasty with the rot of drug addiction from within, but that was unlikely the thinking of the times. Instead, slave trafficking, piracy, and drug smuggling were the engine of financial profits, contributing to the rise of Western empires that successfully used force and superior weaponry to get what they want all over the world. China was no exception. From 1757 to 1842, all international trade was regulated by the Qing Dynasty in China. All foreign trade was isolated to the port city of Canton in southern China. Known as the Canton System, It was the first implemented to keep an eye on trade as well as foreign missionary activity. With the new popularity of Chinese tea, silk, porcelain, and rice, the low demand in China for foreign products, all transactions had to be paid in silver. Well, this forced merchants to come up with a systematic scheme. First, the opium was bought in Bengal, India. Second, the illegal opium was sold in China for silver. Third, the silver from the drug profits were used to buy tea, silk, rice, porcelain for export to Europe, financing more opium purchases. The First Opium War from 1839 to 1842 began when the Chinese officials confiscated and destroyed British opium in Canton. This action caused Britain to respond with gunboat diplomacy. Superior military technology was critical against the Qing army that had 220,000 men. The aftermath of the conflict saw the end of the Canton system, the British acquisition of Hong Kong, and 4 more treaty ports were opened for trade. These included Amoy, Foochow, Ningpo, and Shanghai. 14 years later, from 1856 to 1860, the Second Opium War saw Britain and France allied against the Qing dynasty. It began over a skirmish aboard a former pirate boat called the Arrow, which had been captured by the Chinese, resold to the British, and raided by the Chinese. The British consul in Canton, Harry Parkes, contacted Yimen Chen, who was the imperial commissioner of Canton, to release 14 of the prisoners taken by the Chinese. Yimen Chen released 9 prisoners, but kept 3, thereby insulting the British and starting the war. Harry Parkes was so infuriated with Yimen Chen, he wanted to humiliate him. So that's what he did. So after the bombardment and burning of Canton, he sent Yimen Chen to prison in Calcutta, where he died a year later of disease. France joined the war in response to the execution of French missionary Auguste Chapdelaine in Guangxi province, where missionaries were not allowed. Chapdelaine was accused of stirring up insurrection, plus he refused to pay a bribe. For his crimes, he was ordered arrested. Then he was beaten, put into a small cage and hung in public, where he died. He was later decapitated. Near the end of the Second Opium War, Harry Parkes led a diplomatic mission of 35 people to discuss the terms of surrender in Peking. Sen Rinchen, the Mongolian nobleman and imperial commissioner of the Qing military, arrested Harry Parkes and his diplomats in retaliation for the capture of the prefect of Tianjin. 4 days later, Sen Rinchen and the Qing military were defeated in Tianjin at the bridge of Bailai Ko, allowing the French Anglo forces unimpeded access to Peking, which they had been attempting for 2 years. When Harry Parkes' delegation were arrested, they were brought to the Ministry of Justice, where they were tortured by Ling Qi, otherwise known as death by 1,000 cuts. For Westerners in China, this torture was symbolic of Chinese barbarism. The technique involved being tied to a post, having wet tourniquets applied. Then once the wet tourniquets dried, they cut off the blood flow, which prolonged the suffering as long knives were used to cut flesh into the bone. Slowly, very, very slowly. As they suffered, members of Harry Parkes' delegation cried for water. Instead, dirt was poured down their throats to keep them quiet. Prince Gong, the brother of the Xingfang emperor and later pro-Western reformer, saved Harry Parkes and fellow negotiator Henry Locke from some of the torture when it became clear the Anglo forces were going to take Peking. The rest of the entourage were less fortunate. Although 14 eventually were set free, 20 were recovered dead in unrecognizable mangled states. In one of the most famous events of the Second Opium War, Henry Locke's superior commander, James Bruce, also known as the 8th Earl of Elgin, ordered the looting and destruction of the Summer Palace, where the imperial court spent 2/3 of its time. This looting was thought of as a punishment for the Qing court's behavior regarding the torture of the diplomats. Lord Elgin seriously considered burning down all of Beijing, but had no desire to hurt innocent people or jeopardize the new treaty. Besides the visceral punishment of palace burning to the Qing dynasty, the Treaty of Peking was signed. The treaty legalized recreational opium, gave rights to missionaries who were allowed full access to China with the rights to evangelize and own property. The port of Kowloon was ceded to the British, and new foreign treaty ports were opened. Meanwhile, the biggest threat to the Qing dynasty was the Taiping Rebellion, which lasted 14 years from 1850 to 1864. It was led by Hong Xiquan, who was heavily influenced by Christianity and proclaimed himself the brother of Jesus. He and his followers took over a significant part of China on a religious and social crusade against the Qing dynasty. Death tolls during the 14-year Taiping Rebellion numbered in the range of 20 to 30 million Chinese, proving one of the most deadly conflicts of the 1800s. Whereas the First and Second Opium Wars saw Qing military and civilian deaths near about 50,000. The Chinese Imperial Maritime Customs Service was established after the abolishment of the Canton system as a result of the First Opium War. It was controlled by the Qing dynasty, yet staffed at senior levels by foreigners with the initial purpose of collecting maritime trade taxes that the Chinese officials could not collect during the Taiping Rebellion. The Imperial Maritime Customs Service began a major expansion after the Second Opium War, with more treaty ports opening in Swatow, Nanking, Hankow, and Tianjin. The next important development towards the creation of the large dragon stamps is the coming of Robert Hart to China. In 1854, a very well-educated 19-year-old Robert Hart arrived in China as a student looking for adventure. He took a position as an interpreter at the British Consular Service, having learned Chinese from a man who spoke no English. It was then he began his personal diaries, which by the end of his lifetime in 1911 consisted of 77 volumes, all of which survived and are still being translated and studied today. 4 years after Hart's arrival in China, at the ripe age of 23, he was working as an interpreter for Harry Parkes. To bump up his pay, in 1859, Hart was appointed to the Chinese Imperial Maritime Customs Service to work with Horatio Nelson Ley in Shanghai. Within a few years, Chinese officials were referring to Hart as "our Hart," and they saw him as someone they deeply trusted and had their best interests in mind. Horatio Nelson Ley was the first inspector of the General Customs Service, but was dismissed in 1863 primarily for his inability to comprehend China, as well as his handling of money. Over time, the responsibilities of the Imperial Maritime Customs Service grew significantly. By age 29 in 1863, Hart was appointed chief officer after Ley had left. Hart was now officially the most powerful foreigner in China and had plans to transform the country into a modern trading empire. Hart was extremely efficient in management for the Chinese. He increased the revenue to the point of 80% of the imperial budget. This financial influx caused a great period of westernization, breathing life into the last half-century of the Qing dynasty. At its height, the Customs Service employed 18,000 Chinese and 1,500 foreigners. Part of the mission was to supervise navigation, lighthouses, and surveys, reduce piracy with Chinese steamboats, establish foreign diplomatic missions by inducing Chinese officials to send government representatives to Europe. They wanted to use international law to the Chinese benefit and improve communication. Essentially, the mission of the Customs Service was to assist in the modernization of a reluctant empire. To do this, they needed a key ally in the court, and that was Prince Gong. In the summer of 1861, Robert Hart met with Prince Gong and other Qing officials in favor of modernization. This was when he first proposed the creation of the Chinese post office. Unfortunately, this likely did not go well because the topic really doesn't surface for another 15 years. There was seriously intense debate, philosophical debate between Western technology and Western methods. Hart argued China should adopt technology liberally, while Western methods should be adopted piece by piece. By 1867, mail was weekly going between Peking and Tianjin. This was a distance between the two cities of about 80 miles, and all the mail was transported by foot. No postage stamps were issued. It would have been an unlikely prediction that the first stamps of China were an indirect outcome of events that happened on the border of Burma in 1875. But sometimes reality is stranger than fiction. But this brings us to the end of our first episode of Showing Stamps Talking History, The Large Dragons of China, 1878 to 1885. Please subscribe to this channel for updates on our second episode coming in a week or so. Well, I'll discuss how the Marjorie Affair led to essays, proofs, and various printings of the large dragon stamps. Before I go, I want to get to a little bit of the show part of the episode and give the viewer a look at some of the collecting opportunities that can be found with the large dragon stamps. Enjoy, and thank you for watching.